What if the girl we thought was our hero was actually the greatest monster Hawkins has ever seen? What if Vecna, the nightmare who haunted Max, was desperately trying to save the world from something far worse? In this timeline, 11 isn't running from Hawkins Lab because she's being hunted. She's running because she's about to unleash hell on Earth. And the only person who can stop her is the monster from the Upside Down. This is the story of how one decision changed everything. 3 days after Will disappeared, 11 didn't run into the rain and find Mike in the woods. Instead, she stood in the middle of Hawkins' lab and did something that would haunt Dr. Brenner's nightmares forever. She killed everyone, not in self-defense, not in fear, but methodically, systematically, like she was cleaning. The girl who Mike would have called Elle, the girl who would have loved Egos and learned what friendship meant, that girl never existed in this timeline because the Mind Flayer had already rewritten her, convinced her that humanity was the disease and she was the cure. But here's where it gets interesting. In the Upside Down, there was another psychic, another child who had been experimented on, Subject 1, the boy who would become Vecna. But in this timeline, one wasn't consumed by revenge against 11 for banishing him. Instead, he was watching in horror as the Mind Flayer slowly corrupted the most powerful psychic on Earth, because one knew something no one else did. If the Mind Flayer fully took control of 11, it wouldn't just invade Hawkins. It would use her power to open gates everywhere, in every city, every country, every corner of the planet. The Upside Down wouldn't be a parallel dimension anymore. It would be our dimension. And one realized he had to do the impossible. He had to become a hero. Meanwhile, Mike Wheeler was having the worst week of his life. His best friend was missing. The entire town was searching. And Nancy kept telling him that something else was happening, something with the lights at their house. But then Mike found something in the woods. Not a scared little girl asking for help. He found evidence, military vehicles abandoned, bodies of Hawkins Lab personnel scattered in the forest, and scorch marks in the shape of a handprint. Dustin was the one who put it together first. Whatever killed those soldiers, it was small, like kid-sized small. Lucas didn't want to believe it. You're saying a kid did this? That's insane. But Mike remembered something Nancy said about the lights, about how Mom thought Will was communicating, about how something was in their house. And that's when everything changed. The lights in Joyce Byers' house started spelling out a message. But it wasn't Will. She, Mike whispered. She who? The door exploded inward, and standing in the doorway, covered in dirt and ash, with eyes that glowed like dying stars, was a little girl, but she didn't want to hurt them, not yet. She wanted something else, something that would make what comes next even more horrifying. Chief Jim Hopper had seen a lot of impossible things in his years, but nothing prepared him for this. A child with psychic powers, government conspiracies, and now, standing in Joyce Byers' living room, asking for one thing. Where is Mike? Joyce stepped in front of the boys, trembling but defiant. You're not taking these kids. But here's the thing about this version of 11. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't sadistic. She was efficient, logical. The Mind Flayer had convinced her that emotions were weaknesses. Attachments were vulnerabilities. And yet, when she looked at Mike Wheeler, this scrawny kid with the bowl cut and the terrified eyes, something flickered, some small buried piece of the girl she could have been. You remind me of someone, 11 said, her voice cracking for just a moment. But before Mike could respond, before that moment could break through the Mind Flayer's control, the walls started cracking, not with ice like they would when the Demogorgon came through, but with something else. Red veins, spreading across the ceiling, the floor, like an infection. And from those cracks stepped something that made Hopper lower his gun in pure shock. It was a monster, scarred, horrifying, covered in vines and decay. But it wasn't attacking. It was standing between 11 and the kids. And what Vecna said next would change everything they thought they knew about heroes and monsters. 11, Vecna said, his voice rough but human. I know you can still hear me. I know you're in there. See, what none of them knew, what even Brenner hadn't figured out, was that 1 and 11 had always been connected. When she sent him to the Upside Down, she didn't just banish him, she created a psychic link, a tether. And in all those years in the Upside Down, while one transformed into Vecna, while his body mutated and his mind broke, he stayed connected to her, feeling her pain, her fear, her loneliness. He felt the moment the Mind Flayer took control. He felt her scream silently for help, and he realized that this, stopping her from destroying humanity, this was his redemption, his purpose. Mike stepped forward against Hopper's protests. What do you mean she's still in there? She just killed like 20 people. Because that's what the Mind Flayer wants you to think, Vecna said. It wants you to fear her, to hate her. So when the time comes to make the choice, you won't hesitate to kill her. Dustin pushed up his hat, trying to process. Okay, so you're saying you're the good guy? You, the literal nightmare monster from hell? I'm saying I'm the only one who can get through to her, Vecna replied. But I need your help. I need bait. And what he was asking them to do would require more courage than anything they'd ever faced in the Upside Down. The plan was insane, suicidal even. Vecna would use the party, specifically Mike, as bait to draw 11 to a specific location. The old quarry, the same place where they once looked for Will's body. While 11 was distracted by Mike, Vecna would attempt to enter her mind psychically, like he did with Max. But instead of killing her, he'd try to reach the real 11, the girl buried under the Mind Flayer's control. It meant he'd be vulnerable, completely exposed. If he failed, if the Mind Flayer was too strong, he'd die. And without him, there'd be no one powerful enough to stop 11 from opening gates across the entire world. Hopper hated it. Joyce was crying, saying they couldn't risk the kids. But Nancy understood what was at stake. If we don't do this, she said quietly, everyone dies. Not just Hawkins. Everyone. But here's what nobody expected. Not Vecna, not the party, not even the Mind Flayer itself. Mike Wheeler was falling in love with a monster, or more accurately, with the ghost of the girl trapped inside the monster. Because during the preparation, during those hours waiting for night to fall, Vecna told them stories. Stories about who 11 was before the Mind Flayer, her favorite number, her fear of loud noises, how she'd hum to herself when she thought no one was listening. And Mike realized that somewhere in that monster was a girl who never got to eat Eggos, or watch Star Wars, or know what it felt like to have friends. And that realization would make the next part unbearable. The plan went wrong immediately. 11 didn't wait for them to set the trap. She came to Hawkins Middle School during the day when it was full of kids, and she made an announcement that would echo in Hawkins history forever. Bring me Mike Wheeler, or I start killing students. The party had 10 minutes before she made good on that threat. Lucas wanted to fight. Dustin wanted to run. But Mike walked out of the school, alone, hands raised. And when 11 saw him, really saw him, something happened that the Mind Flayer didn't anticipate. She hesitated. Why? She whispered, her voice not the cold monotone from before, but broken. Why aren't you running? Mike took a step closer, then another, until he was within arm's reach of instant death. Because I don't think you want to hurt me, Mike said, voice cracking. I think you're just scared and alone, and nobody ever taught you that. It's okay to be scared. And for one perfect, impossible moment, Eleven's eyes turned brown, completely brown. The real 11 broke through, but the Mind Flayer wasn't done, not even close. The Mind Flayer erupted from 11's body, physically manifesting in the real world for the first time. Vecna burst from the upside down, vines and all, throwing himself between Mike and the Mind Flayer's attack. "Run!" he screamed at Mike, but Mike couldn't move, because he was watching 11, the real 11, fighting inside her own body, fighting to stay in control for just a few more seconds. And with the last bit of strength she had, 11 did something that would haunt Mike Wheeler for the rest of his life. She mouthed 2 words, "Kill me." Vecna saw it too, and he knew what had to happen. The thing he'd been trying to avoid this entire time. "Mike," Vecna said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I can stop this. I can stop her, but you need to give me permission, because once I start, there's no going back." Nancy was aiming her gun. Lucas had a wrist rocket. Dustin was screaming something about a plan. But Mike knew the truth. The 11 who could have been his friend, who could have eaten Eggos and laughed at his jokes and been part of the party, she never really got to exist. But in this moment, in these few seconds where she'd broken through, she was finally free, finally herself, and she was asking him to let her go. "I'm sorry," Mike whispered. And 11, the real 11, smiled for the first and last time. What Vecna did next would save Hawkins, but destroy everything they thought they knew about sacrifice. Vecna didn't kill 11. Instead, he did something far more painful. He entered her mind completely. Every memory, every moment of torture, every second of loneliness. He absorbed it all, and then he took the Mind Flayer with him. He ripped it out of her consciousness, dragging it into his own mind, taking on the full force of its corruption, its rage, its hatred. 11 collapsed, powerless, human, alive, but free. And Vecna dragged the Mind Flayer back through the gate, back to the upside down, but he couldn't seal it from the outside. Someone had to stay. Someone had to hold the gate closed from inside, forever. The last thing the party heard before the gate sealed was Vecna's voice, distorted, fading, but unmistakably at peace. "She deserves better than this world gave her," he said. "Take care of her. Give her the life she should have had." And then he was gone. The monster who became a hero, trapped forever in the place he'd tried so hard to escape. 3 months later, Hawkins was still recovering. 43 people died in what the government called a chemical leak. The party knew better. They knew the real cost. 11, who they now called Jane because she wanted a real name, lived with the Byers. She had no powers anymore, no connection to the upside down. She was just a kid. Mike visited her every day after school, not because he loved her romantically, not yet, anyway, but because he'd promised. He'd promised Vecna. She was learning to talk more, to smile, to be scared of normal things like math tests and bullies instead of world-ending monsters. And sometimes, late at night, when she had nightmares about the lab or the Mind Flayer, she'd remember something. A voice, deep and broken and sad, but kind. The monster who saved her life. The hero nobody would ever remember. Lucas asked once if they thought Vecna was still alive down there, in the upside down, holding the gate closed. Dustin said probably not, that nobody could survive that long. But Mike knew better. Because sometimes, when Jane fell asleep, she'd whisper in her sleep, "Thank you," and in the upside down, sitting in darkness, holding back an ocean of hatred and chaos with nothing but willpower and the memory of one little girl's smile. Vecna whispered back, "You're welcome." And that is what would have happened if 11 was the villain and Vecna was the hero. A timeline where the person we thought was the monster turned out to be the only one brave enough to sacrifice everything. But here's what I want you to think about. In the comments below, tell me, do you think Vecna could ever really be redeemed? Or was he always destined to be the villain? And if you want to see more Stranger Things, what if scenarios, hit that subscribe button right now. Next video, we're exploring what would happen if Will Byers had superpowers like 11. Trust me, you do not want to miss that. I'll see you in the next timeline.